This is amazing.
It is.
Can you just like give yourself a clap, pat on your back, this is great. Thank you so much. So, hey, my name is Myron, this is Craig. I'm black, he's white. Actually, did you know this? Did you know that at the beginning of our country's history, when it came to filling out applications, that we created this class where I, as an African, was called black, which meant inferior, and then you from Europe, there was a class and we were called white, and so all of it, which meant superior. And so when I go and fill out an application, I have to put that I'm inferior. And so, did you know that there aren't many races? There's one race, and we are ethnically different. And diversity is something that's very valuable. And I love Warren Buffett's, I might just hijack that. So thank you so much for having us. We do have a question for you that's an additional icebreaker. Some of you have already answered the question, some of you have not. So this is what we're gonna do. I'd like you to close your eyes. This is a Creative Morning, and I am now a part of Creative Morning, so thank you. But close your eyes, we're gonna do something creative. We're gonna use our imagination. So we're in Omaha, you're in Omaha somewhere, you're driving. I won't tell you where you're driving, but there's a drug transaction happening. The drug dealer is right there, you see him, you know, your cousin is a police officer, you're about to call your cousin, and you see this drug transaction happening. And you kind of slow down because you're nosy and you're looking. What does that drug dealer look like? Is he a man? Is she a woman? What ethnicity are they? What do they have on? Open your eyes. Okay. So crowd participation. What did you see? Someone told me they seen the doctor. I was like, amazing.
I see me.
You see you selling drugs?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did.
Wow. Thank you for being honest.
Yeah.
Thank you for honesty around here.
Yeah.
I see a very good friend.
What did you see? You say that again?
A very good friend.
You see a very good friend. Okay.
Well, originally when I read the paper, I saw a lawyer in wingtips, and then now when you did that way, I went, well, I guess I see part of me. So it depends on the narrative. So that's how I saw it.
Yeah.
A lawyer or me.
I see a sad person.
Yeah.
A drug dealer, a sad person, maybe had a rough life, but I also drew horns, so, taken over by an evil force of some sort.
Okay.
But it wasn't an ethnic thought that came to my mind.
Yeah, let me jump in. The truth is, and this is proven out statistically, the truth is, especially for us as white people, we see a black person. We see a black man. And that started in the 1980s with the drug war. And all we saw on TV for 20 years was every time there were drugs happening, it was an inner city situation where it was a black male that was dealing drugs. And that's a hard thing for us to admit. Especially out here in 2017, I think that culture's changing some. But the reality is, that's the world that I grew up in. I'm a product of the 1980s. I'm 52, so I graduated high school in 1983, about the beginning of the drug war. And so I can remember going back, and I can remember that drug war starting, and I'm reading about this, and I understand now, today, that culture processed me in a way that made me think, and this is why we came up with this question, made me think that guy standing in the corner, that was a black male that was dealing drugs. That's a hard thing for us to talk about. As we talk about equality here today, we're just going to do this. We have such a short amount of time. We're just going to do this a little bit by telling our stories and then how we intersected. So Myron's going to let me start a little bit. In fact, we've got a slide here. that shows Myron and I when we were young.
My picture looks better. My picture looks better.
A little scary. I know I had hair way back then. My kids can't even believe that. But I tell you what, I grew up here in Papillion, all right? And if you know Papillion, I've spent my whole life in Nebraska. I just grew up that middle class, white kid who things like race, that wasn't even a part of my life. It wasn't even an issue for me. Poverty, poverty was something where people somewhere else were in poverty because they were making bad choices, because they were dealing drugs, and they decided to do poorly in school. And if they would just make better choices, they don't have to be in poverty. That was kind of the world I grew up in. So these issues of race and poverty and equality, I mean, they really meant nothing to me growing up in a place like Papillion. Now hear Myron's story.
And it's interesting enough, as we had lunch, I believe, a couple weeks ago, and he's telling me things like, Myron, man, I just did not know. And I'm across from the table and I'm saying, you a man of faith. This is what I'm thinking. I didn't tell him that, but I'm like, you a man of faith and you gonna lie to my face? that you just didn't know about the economic challenges of young African Americans, and you just didn't know, and all of a sudden it just dawned on me, you know what? You don't know when you don't have to know. You just don't. When you're far removed, when your life is different, you really just don't know. And so for me, I'm on the opposite side of the spectrum. My mama was a crackhead. My daddy was on heroin. My mama was in and out of prison. My dad was in and out of prison. She was a prostitute. We were in and out of grandmama's house. We were very transient, project after project. And then all of a sudden, gangs took a hold of my life. And so when from the West Coast all the way here with the drug trade, not only did drugs come to Omaha, but with drugs came gangs. And with gangs comes family, because family is all you know. And so here I am, I'm a young guy, I'm 13, 14, I'm selling dope, I'm doing crime, I'm in and out of jail. 16, I'm facing 100 years in prison. I go to prison, I get out, I'm right back, and that's just my life. 18, I'm facing 200 years in prison, and so here I am standing before the judge, and the judge says, young man, today I'm going to make an example out of you. And I leave the courtroom with a 14 to 30 year sentence without parole. And so that's just the backdrop of a young guy from a place called North Omaha where, you know, when he say he doesn't know, for me it's like, man, how can you not know? But that's the difference between the disparity gap of Anglo-Americans, European Americans, and African Americans.
Yeah, and I'd like to tell you that, you know, once I hit 18, 20, I started to know. I started to understand, but that wouldn't be true. You know, my story is I went to college here at UNO, got my IT degree, went in the IT world. I'm a serial entrepreneur, so I got with some other guys and we started some businesses, and I built and sold a few businesses along the way, and have always loved helping people. That's always kind of been a part of my life. That was just a fabric that was in me. And so I was always looking for ways to be involved in helping people around the world or helping people here. But this issue of race, this issue of inequality, this was a political issue. This is something I watched on TV that was happening in other places. What really started to change for me was with the Ferguson event, which I think was like 2008 or 9, 10, somewhere in there. You guys remember the Michael Brown shooting? It happened in St. Louis. And I remember, I can picture it. I'm sitting in the room with my wife, we're watching TV, we're watching these riots that are going on, and there's thousands of people protesting. And I said, you know, I'm not talking about the people smashing windows. It's just people doing that have an opportunity. But I said to my wife, I said, why are thousands of African Americans walking down the street protesting? People that are like me, just of a different race. I don't get this. And I told my wife, I said, they have a perspective that I want to understand. And so just a couple weeks later, I was actually asked to be on a panel, a multi-race panel. I think you were in the room. I was the only white guy on the panel. I said I'm the token bald guy on the panel. And we were talking about this Ferguson issue. And there's a couple of other pastors up there like Myron, guys that I love, and guys that I have huge respect for. And when they speak, I listen. And their perspective was so different. And so afterwards, I remember grabbing one of the young pastors and I said, dude, I can't even understand how you see the Michael Brown thing this way. How could you possibly? He started to explain to me, and I felt like for the first time in my life, I listened. For the first time in my life, I said, you know what? You have a different perspective, and it's a valid perspective. The system has always worked for me as a white guy. That's why I had this perspective. And he said, Craig, the system hasn't worked for me as a black guy. This is why I have perspective. So he said, I want you to do something. I want you to go read a book called The New Jim Crow. I don't know, you guys read or heard of that book? Written by a African-American female ACLU attorney named Michelle Alexander. Not a book that I usually probably would ever read. And I read that book. I highly recommend all of you read that book. My staff at work, I have them read that book when they join my team. And I'm not a guy that ever cries. Like, I'm just not a crier. Twice while I was reading that book by myself, I broke down weeping over the stuff that I didn't know that was happening to African Americans in our country. I could not believe it. I thought I knew about race. I knew nothing about race. I thought I understood poverty as I'm starting to work with Myron in addressing issues of poverty in North Omaha. And I realized, man, I knew nothing about poverty. This issue of equality, I thought I knew about equality. And I came to this place where I realized I'm like a newborn baby. I know nothing about equality. What I learned is that Myron and I, we are not playing by the same rules.
And that's interesting. That statement right there. We are not playing by the same rules. Let me say that again. We are not playing by the same rules. When I was in prison, one of the things that you see if you've read the book on mass incarceration, which I do recommend, is everyone in prison, and it's interesting how people become institutionalized in prison, but everyone in prison, you talk about equality, in prison, equality does not exist. Let me say that again. In prison, equality does not exist. You are there because you committed a crime and you are terrible, and you're going to pay every dime of it. And when you get out of prison, I'm going to continue to make you pay when you have to fill out an application, and the application says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And they call you back and they say, I'm sorry, but we found another person for the job. And I think what happens when, if you're, European American, Anglo American, a lot of times, and I've heard people say this, is number one, I wasn't there. I didn't put black people, like, I didn't do it. Or number two, you feel shame, or you feel like, man, I don't even want to be white. I don't even want to show my face. And I think both are not a way that we could actually move the ball forward. It's not really the best way to move the ball forward. And I love what you said, Craig. You said, I just started to listen. And I think as we, in our country, I think Nebraska is becoming this model, Omaha really is becoming this model city of what it means, Chief Schmatter, all these, Ben Gray, all these guys who are coming together, and we're seeing that if we're going to move the ball forward, we have to address equality, yes, individually, but also systematically. Because it's not enough for him and I to be good friends. But it is enough for us to get on mission together and collaborate and say, hey, what can we do to address some of the systemic issues that are happening in our city, and how can we approach it and do it the same way? And that's why we're working in North Omaha together. I'm working in a little small community, 30th to 36, Lake to Hamilton. I'm also part of an organization called Empowerment Network. Anybody familiar with Empowerment Network? Empowerment Network, Willie Barney started that organization 10 years ago, and I'm telling you, it is one of the best organizations that are promoting collaboration. And so we're working in North Omaha together to see some of the systemic things actually change. And so, I was so poor. I say poor, it's actually poor. I was so poor, I didn't know I was poor. I mean, that's poor. And one of the things socioeconomically that Ruby Payne talks about, if you're familiar with understanding the framework of poverty, you should listen to that on audiobook. It's better. She talks about how there are different, for example, when black folks eat, my mama would ask me, did you get enough? Poor. Middle class, how was it? How was the food? Affluent, it's all about presentation. How does it look? And I hate going to those places that give you those little bite-sized, it's like, are you kidding me? But we're working together on several initiatives to actually bring about some systemic change, working with Franklin Elementary School and mentoring. Did you know if a kid can't read at the age of 6 or 7, that person is on his or her way to prison? Did you know that? And so we're saying, let's get on the front end of this. It's going to take a long time, but we're dedicated to that. We're dedicated to working together. We're dedicated to mentoring. We're dedicated to employability. We're dedicated to helping people who are young entrepreneurs but don't have the bandwidth to actually step out there and launch a company. And I tell you what, here's the problem. Here's the problem. A lot of times, young African Americans, for me, when I was growing up, I was trying to get out of the community. I'm like, man, if I can just make it out. But what happens is when a young African American makes it out of the ghetto and he leaves, all of a sudden the resourcefulness of our community is leaving. So there's a mantra, there's an attitude. The attitude is we're trying to get our kids through education. All the mamas, you got to make it. Girl, I hope you can get to the WNBA because you got to bring me out the ghetto. And then all of a sudden, all of our leaders are leaving. And so when you have all of our leaders leaving, then we have a leaderless society. And if it's a leaderless society, then poverty will increase, violence will increase, and things will never change.
One of the things Myron and we'll have another slide here in a second. Oh, actually, I go there. This is a kind of a drive home point for us today. This idea of equality, and it starts with we have to have unity. And one of the things that he and I have gotten to know each other in the last 7 years, I realized that we both grew up learning not to trust each other because of our race.
Right.
I grew up, and that's why we started with that question. I mean, nobody ever told me, don't trust a black person, but everything I saw was black people are, Michelle Alexander says this in her book, and it was so meaningful. She says, to be black in America is to be a criminal.
Yeah. And
that I had to stop, and I think it was one of the points where I broke down crying over how sad that is. And I, maybe I'm that asshole she was talking about. I hope you don't think that. But, I never thought I was better than anybody else, but I didn't realize that I wasn't equal. And so I grew up in a sort of, I'm not sure if I want to trust a guy like Myron.
Yeah.
Tell some of your stories about how you didn't trust
Yeah,
white people.
so when I was a kid, now listen, this was crazy. So I'm coming home from elementary school, and I liked girls at an early age, and coming home, and I bring my girlfriend home, I'm coming home from school, I'm innocent. And she was a little white girl, and I just liked her, right? And so I bring her to the door, and I'm like, Mom, I have a girlfriend. It's like the 9th one, it's just like, and she comes to the door, and she says something that just changed my perspective on white people for a long time. She looked at me and yelled at me and said, you better not ever bring a white girl home. We don't do that around here. She snatched me up, brought me in the house, and that was the end of that relationship. But the lesson I walked away from was this. They're bad, and we're trying to just get out from up under the oppression of white folks. And so you accelerate the story, the narrative in middle school, and all of a sudden we're having parent-teacher conferences, and I come in, we have a parent-teacher conference, and my teacher is, saying how much of a problem I am, and I walk away and I say this to my mom. She just said that to me because I'm black. And all of a sudden in my household, there was this story that white people can't be trusted because of the history that we have, and then not only just the history that we have, but white people use the Bible to enslave a whole society of Africans. And Myron, you bet not trust them, because to trust them is to side with them. And that was the narrative. And so when I went to prison, all my stories are about prison. When I went to prison, I'm in a jail cell for 6 years with a white dude. First time. I'm like, this is weird. And all of a sudden I got to see the differences, and yet the similarities of him being white, me being black. And proximity has a way of destroying our biases. Problem with how our city is set up is anything west of 72nd is affluent white folks, and anything east of 72nd are poor African Americans, Hispanics, and refugees. And so we have to work a lot harder at intentionally building relationships so that we can get to know one another, so that we can actually destroy this term I'm going to give you, racial implicit biases that we all have. Because we don't know what we don't know, but we have what we have based on the culture we've lived in. And so as I've had an opportunity to hang out with you and you had an opportunity to hang out with me, we can ask those dumb questions that we think are dumb but actually are not dumb. Like, for example, do black people really like watermelon?
I remember one of my first
I don't
times.
like watermelon. I don't like it. I like strawberries, man.
One of my first times getting to know Myron, I said, I hope you don't forgive me for this, brother, but is it okay for me to say black, or do I always have to say African American? I mean, that was just a basic question that honestly white people have. And so as we got to know each other, though, we started to develop unity. Man, we can talk about all these things now together, and sometimes they might be stupid questions, but they're just real.
Right.
And there's an old saying, confession is good for the soul, but poor for the reputation. I feel like I'm coming out with a poor reputation, but I'm just trying to be real here.
Yeah.
That a lot of us as maybe middle class, upper class, non-African American people, we have things going on inside of us that we don't know what to do with, and oftentimes we hide them.
Right.
Because we don't know what to do with them.
When we look at the word equality, we automatically think race. Because of the historical narrative of our country. And I think we have such an opportunity to, for equality to be truly equality. But here's the question that we sometimes ask. Oh, what can little I do? It's like, oh man, I'm a mom, I got 2 kids, I ain't messing with nobody, man. Like, what in the world can I do? Or I'm just this entry-level person in this marketing firm. Like, how can I really make a difference? And I'm so glad you said that, because I think the greatest difference we can make begins with competence. The greatest difference begins with competence. I don't know what I don't know. And sometimes the best way to know is to be in atmospheres and venues like Creative Mornings. It gives me an opportunity. So my encouragement would be, what is going on in our city that will help me become more ethnically competent, that will help me become more competent when it comes to, male and female, the gender suffrage? Like, what actually is going on in our city? Because ignorance will kill us if we don't know what we don't know. And that's the importance of reconciliation. If I don't know that you're a product of oppression and I'm a part of that oppressive system, then it's hard for me to, number one, identify, and man, it's hard for me to even reconcile. It's hard for me to say I'm sorry if I don't know. But I think the process of reconciliation begins at the intersection of, tell me more.
Yeah, I go back to my story there. I mean, the relationship that I had with African Americans and listening, I started to go, okay, people that I love and trust are telling me something that is new to me. And so that's why I was willing to listen. If I didn't have a relationship, I would have just been feeding whatever culture's feeding me all the time.
Right.
So that relationship, and this really applies, I mean, even in, we're talking your situation here, is to have equality, we have to have some unity. And if we're going to have unity, we've got to be reconciled. And what's cool is like Myron and I work together, once we begin that relationship of reconciliation, there's a peace in our relationship, and we can go after things like inequality and poverty. And we're doing all kinds of stuff together in North Omaha. One of the coolest things I've done in my church, Christ Community, big, huge church out in West Omaha, is we have huge volunteer days in North Omaha, in the neighborhoods actually where Myron's church is. And we call it Step Into North Omaha. And really, literally, it's designed, 500-600 people on one day. Just step into that part of the city, because quite frankly, many will never drive through that part of the city if they can avoid it.
Right.
And the change in the last 5-6 years of having a few thousand people at our church step into North Omaha and realize this is wonderful. And we'll go door to door and we'll meet people, and people are realizing, man, this is amazing. It has been transformative for us to start interacting with people in a different part of our city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One big takeaway is simply this: competence. Competence. Cross-cultural competence. And the more we build relationships, the more we're in venues like this, the more we can listen. I love what you're saying, because listening requires empathy, right? Like, the more empathic we are, the more we can establish trust. And that's what we're doing. Our work really is about establishing trust. I would encourage you, read Mass Incarceration. I would encourage you to read Understanding the Framework for Poverty. Also, I have a podcast. I talk a lot about racial reconciliation. Myron Pierce. It's just another way to just have more ongoing conversation. We would love to have more conversation if you want. I'm really open for coffee and things like that. But really check those books out. And some other people that in our city, this is what they're doing. I think in October last year, when the Minnesota thing happened, about 800 people gathered together. That I convened, and after that, we started having what we call diversity groups. And these diversity groups were just opportunities to continue on the conversation. And I would encourage you, even out of Creative Morning, people who we've met in here, or maybe have met for the second time, hey, what do you think about going out for coffee and maybe having some more conversation? What do you think about continuing on this conversation, continuing on our cross-cultural competence, so that we can actually add value to the conversation in our country? Yeah. So in closing, one of the things I'm very encouraged by is this space of people. And I'll be honest. Can I be honest? I thought I was coming into an all-white conversation. But when I came in and saw my brother Frank, and I came in and saw my man Phil, and I came in and saw Jason, and you, and it's just like, okay, if we can create more conversation, if we can have more honest dialogue, I stood on those steps, and I just said, you know what, this space right here, I think has some potential to do some good when it comes to addressing systemic challenges that we have in our city. So thank you so much for having us. Thank you so much. Thank you.